Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you to Greg and the Divinity School. I don't usually get invitations from schools of divinity, so it was, for me, a special pleasure. There was a baby in the room. Jackie is now reminding me, 10 years ago, she was at the farm. Before that, she was at the Slow Food University, which is where I first met her. Yes, and Vivian, we know you're here, and you're the generation that's going to make it all different. Just two things to follow up where Mary left. Shakti is creative power. The power to act. Literally, the Sanskrit says the power to act. In Sanskrit, Prakriti is an expression of that power to act, which is nature. But the power to act is in everyone. It just so happens in a time where centuries, and more recently the last 2 centuries, have allowed entire structures to be defined on the basis that action has to be violent and destructive. And therefore, only that action will count, and the creative action of nature, of the seed to become seed, of women to sustain families and communities, especially in times of war, in terms of violence, that Shakti actually is in anything living. And I think these 200 years of refinement of violent patriarchy as a masculinist project, I always say we need feminism for men, not just for women. We have all kinds of campaigns, help the girl, help the girl. I have a beautiful boy. I haven't helped him, but he is more feminist than I am. And Gandhi used to say a daily prayer. Gandhi really was the person who made compassion a celebratory way. And at a time where other countries were fighting for their independence from the British Empire through violence, he was the one who said, no, I'll pull out a spinning wheel. And it was a spinning wheel that showed me the way on how to deal with a new empire. I mean, first of all, I think agriculture itself has really become part of this amazing war. I was reading this paper on the flight. To me, that is not farming. Yeah. This is not farming. Agriculture is care for the land. And you'll soon be having another person who's reflected a lot on this, Norman, who's worked with Wendell Berry, on how agriculture is care for the land, and any technology that starts helping you become more careless with the land shouldn't be called agriculture. I prefer to call it war, a continuation of war. And it's not just as a metaphor, but if you actually look at its material basis. My background, as Mary explained, was in physics, part of my life in India's Atomic Energy Commission, science policy. I was among those who thought you can go through without eating, and I can do for days without food, it doesn't bother me at all. But it's the violence of Punjab and the Bhopal disaster of '84 that forced me to look at why do we do agriculture that makes farmers rise in discontent? Why do we do agriculture with inputs that kill people? In those days, I was doing a very interesting program for 5 years with the United Nations University based in Tokyo on conflicts over natural resources. And of course, I was looking at river conflicts and forest conflicts and land conflicts. And I wrote to them, I said, I see so many news items about river conflicts. One of the people assassinated in this violence was the head of the dam, the Bhakra Dam. There were 30 killings around a canal to take water out of Punjab, I said, I think there are conflicts over resources in here, and they need to be looked at. And I want to understand what happened to Punjab's waters and Punjab soil. Punjab means the land of 5 rivers. That's where chemical farming was taken. When in 1965 we had a drought, and in those days India used to be able to pay America in rupees for imports. It was called the Public Law 480. So our prime minister of that time asked for a little more wheat because the prices were going up. We didn't have starvation, we didn't have famine, prices were growing up. And he said, to regulate prices, we'd like to import. And we were told, no, you got to apply chemical farming. It was later given a wonderful name, the Green Revolution. Not green, not revolutionary. So I got an opportunity to do this book for the United Nations University. It's now published by Kentucky University Press. It's called The Violence of the Green Revolution. And that's when I realized, where did these chemicals come from? They came from Hitler's labs. They came from what was the cartel that was tried in Nuremberg. Nuremberg was a trial of IG Farben, the cartel for making chemicals. The original reason chemicals were made was how to gas people in the concentration camps. The original reasons poison gases were made is how to kill during the war. They are the ancestors of the pesticides. Even synthetic chemical fertilizer, urea. The original techniques were designed for making ammunition by firing at very high temperature fossil fuels, natural gas, and through fixing atmospheric nitrogen, creating ammunitions on the one hand, and later this could be used for fertilizer, which is why I just think of your mind, how many terrorist acts have been fertilizer bombs. Think of Oklahoma, think of Afghanistan, think of Hyderabad in India, think of that young man in Oslo. They were all fertilizer bombs. This boy kept collecting fertilizer for years, then went and bombed the government buildings. And when I was doing the research, I found they were saying, oh, we won't need soil, we won't need land, because now we can make bread from air. That was the slogan, bread from air. Of course, the plants, the nitrogen-fixing plants, the legumes, the pulses that are part of our daily diet, in India with our vegetarianism, we are a dal-based culture. They know how to fix nitrogen without any of this violence. And they do it so efficiently. If you look at how much damage is being done to the atmosphere, to the use of chemicals, think of it that 1 kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer requires an energy equivalent of 2 liters of diesel. And it'll require 191 billion liters of diesel. 277 billion liters by 2030. And it doesn't end there. One of the most lethal greenhouse gases is nitrous oxide, 300 times more damaging for climate destabilization than carbon dioxide. Most of it, most of the fertilizer applied either runs off in water or evaporates. The runoff to water are what are giving us dead zones in the oceans, killing life in the oceans. This wasn't bred from air. This was really the buildup of an agriculture that looks like war. And it didn't just change the way we treat the land. It sadly changed every category through which we think. So my life since 1984, when I did the study, then I said, I cannot be part of a food system and an agriculture system that has become like war. And I didn't know what name to give it, because I wasn't in the movement at that time. I just called it nonviolent farming. Of course, slowly I realized, oh, they have a name for it. Some call it organic, others call it biodynamic, some call it permaculture. Then I also watched my friends fight over names. I said, ultimately, the laws of nature, the laws of ecology are the same two principles. The principles of healing the nutrient cycle, law of return, and ensuring your hydrological cycle and water cycle is maintained. You do those two things right, you can do it with any name you like. And usually the names of groups are created by founders. You know? It's part of the territorial instinct and colonization instinct that we've naturalized it so much that we all need sects. And of course they're comfortable. But I think we always need to transcend to the level of principles and values and what holds it all together. My work took me to the seed because in 1987 I was invited to a meeting in Geneva on the conference was called Laws of Life. It wasn't a conference as much as a sort of closed think tank meeting. And because I'd done that book, suddenly people talked to me as an expert in agriculture. I mean, I just figured some things out. And I'd applied my physics and math and refused to live through spin. All I did was add numbers and see for myself. So I get called to this meeting where the new biotechnologies are being discussed. And the chemical industry is there, and they're talking about how they're too small. Ciba was too small, Sandoz was too small. And how we've got to become bigger, and we'll be 5 at the end of the century. Well, they've beaten themselves because they're going to be 3, the cartel. You've just approved the Bayer-Monsanto merger in this country. The Europeans have approved it with a few conditionalities. Dow-DuPont. And Dow-DuPont is linked to my beginning of this journey and search for nonviolence in farming, because Dow bought up Union Carbide, whose company it was in the leak of that gas. So when I say the Bhopal accident, my colleagues in Bhopal say, correct yourself, it was a genocide. They knew these gases kill. And to put it near a settlement was not an accident. So first they were too small, they had to get bigger, and they've become bigger. Second was they had to find ways to make money from chemicals and the seed. But how do you make money from something that's in the habit of reproducing and being shared? It is a commons of the ultimate kind. That's where, if I wasn't at that meeting, I wouldn't have done the work I've done in the last 30 years. They said very clearly, we can't create profits through seed alone, through normal seed. It's through genetic engineering whose tools were worked out in public universities. Recombinant DNA was a public tool. If we use the tools of recombinant DNA, we can now claim to be inventors of seed. We can then take patents on seed and on the one hand collect royalties from every farmer in every season. That time they were talking about a trillion every year. And on the other hand, we can make it illegal for farmers to save seeds. Creating these laws is what we have to do through a trade treaty, because not good enough to apply this in America and Europe, where industrial agriculture is. Our profits will only be secure if it's global. And they said so clearly, and therefore we need the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That's why we need the Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, where they had to put T in front of IP, because IP is a national subject. Parliaments and Congresses write IP laws. not an international trade treaty. So they say trade-related, now by definition part of trade. That's the day I decided to start saving seeds as my constructive action. You see, I have a phone sitting there which I thought was dead, but let me put it. So I said, if Gandhi could pull out a spinning wheel when no one was using spinning wheels anymore, because we were all made to believe England would supply textiles to everyone, control the land of this continent, get the labor from Africa, capture markets worldwide. And Gandhi said, no, you've got to have freedom, you've got to make your cloth. And he pulled out the spinning. He first found an old 80-year-old woman to say, do you know how to spin? She said, I used to. I have an old spinning wheel lying in my attic. Just teach me. And he taught the whole nation. And I had sat on my flight back from Geneva with a little matrix. First industrial revolution, fossil fuels, cotton. Second industrial revolution, which went quietly, but Rachel Carson did try to wake us up to it. And the third industrial revolution, which is called industrialization of life and the use of genetic modification. So I said, okay, what's the raw material for this? If it was fossil fuels, it was cotton. It's the seed. So if Gandhi could spin freedom, then surely we can save seeds. And like we were made to believe that you can't make your own cloth, we are now being made to believe you can't save your own seeds. And I had a lovely meeting earlier with the food activists. Or you can't make your own bread. You've got to eat toxic white stuff. I like to have bread that gets fungus when it shouldn't be eaten anymore. That's how I started Navdanya. But I also, because I'm talking 87, we still had sovereignty in our countries at that time. We made our decisions. So I worked with my government, I worked with our parliament, I was appointed on every committee related to issues related to seed, because no one else was doing that work. So we wrote a Farmers' Rights and Plant Variety Act, not a Breeders' Right Act. We wrote an Article 3J, which says plants and animals and seeds are not human inventions. Therefore, they are not subject matter of patentability, because patents are for inventions. And they give the inventor an exclusive right to prevent anyone else from making, saving, exchanging what is patented. It applies to machine, it doesn't apply to seed. And we had an enlightened enough government and parliament that worked on these laws. I'm so happy today, not just happy that I'm here with you and giving the Bartlett lecture, so happy that I missed a court case today in India where Monsanto was trying to challenge our article that excludes patenting of seed and life, and Monsanto has just lost today. And the integrity of creation has been upheld. Of course, after all, my life was where I understood, I thought and dreamt the psi function, the quanta. And it's a big journey to the seed. But I think it's a journey that the seed has helped make. I learned so much. I think we have to redo our ideas of intelligence. Not just from looking at babies, but looking at plants, looking at insects, looking at bees, looking at birds. Because we turned intelligence itself into an intelligence quotient. Remember how many people were declared intrinsically dumb? The original biological determinism was about biologically saying women are inferior, blacks are inferior, other races are inferior, and it's biologically determined. So I find the little seed as, in spite of all the attempt to control, bursting through all the mechanisms of control. And for me, that's Shakti. Yeah? I go over old bridges that are abandoned. 20 years ago, they were abandoned. Today, they're a forest. There are about 3 in my valley, where they got too narrow, had to be made bigger. They're like forest trees are going on this concrete. And for me, every little plant that bursts through the concrete is the power and miracle of life and intelligence. And we need this so much at this time of hopelessness and the sense that we've reached a dead end for the planet, for democracy, for freedom, for justice. Brilliant scientists these days were taking into account the catastrophe we are living through on the planetary level. People like Stephen Hawking, who's no more, said, we have a century before we are extinct on this planet. But of course, because he thought you must always look up into space and not look down on the ground, his recipe was escape to other planets. That's why I wish Stephen Hawking had looked at some farms and realized that, land and the ground has a lot of promise. Elon Musk, fascinating guy. Yeah? He too thinks we've got to escape. Then he goes on and says 7 billion too many. My flights of 1 billion to Mars only take 1 million. And eventually for food we'll sort it out, but I do have an idea of having a Pizza Hut on Mars. You don't have an idea of growing the amazing organisms that make the soil fertile here. Or the amazing power of Gaia to organize her temperature within the level at which human life has evolved. That self-organizing capacity is what James Lovelock talked about, and that's why he called her Gaia. A NASA scientist, not choosing to look for Gaia, being compelled by Gaia to see her. Extinction, in my view, is not inevitable. If we stop pushing other species to extinction, we won't be extinct ourselves. Species don't have to disappear at 1,000 times the normal. It's 10,000 now, 10,000 times the normal rate. 93% of all cultivated biodiversity is gone. This is going to UN data. Just in the last 3 weeks, there was a study out of France called Biodiversity Oblivion, of how 75% birds are gone. Bees we knew about, but in Germany a new study on insects. And all of them are identifying agriculture and the chemicals used in agriculture as a very big driving force. For me, the most disturbing has been the recent study by the Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a UN body like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has looked at land degradation, an aspect we ignore. I think land degradation is bigger. If you look at the planetary boundaries, actually the carbon boundary is not that badly broken as the nitrogen boundary with nitrogen fertilizers, and the species disappearance boundary. Those are the two big red zones if you look at the Stockholm Institute's planetary boundary assessment. Land degradation is important for 2 reasons, because that's where we are, that's where we live. And as an ancient Vedic saying says, in this handful of soil is your future. It's 5,000 years ago. In this handful of soil is your future. Take care of it. It will take care of you. Destroy it. It will destroy you. But more importantly is the fact that every time we are destructive of the soil and the land, we also engage in the same activities that are driving climate change. The emissions from that activity become climate change. The inability to reabsorb the emissions is part of the land degradation, the disappearance of forests, the disappearance of biodiversity in farming. So we can no longer see the issues of agriculture, of land, of climate change as separate compartments. They are part of one process. All of these are symptoms, as is the fact that ecological non-sustainability and social injustice are part of the same process. Over these many years, I have watched these processes, beginning from my time with CHIPCO, beginning from the time when the women in my region came out to defend the forests and created the most amazing movement. They said, we're going to hug the trees. Every time you come with your saws, we're going to hug the trees. And eventually it took 11 years of those actions. And I used to leave Canada every summer, every winter during vacation, and go volunteer for CHIPCO. That's where I call it my other university, where I learned biodiversity from women who were called ignorant because they didn't have a degree. The women recognized that the destruction of the forest was their poverty. The destruction of the forest was their longer walk for water. They said the main thing these forests give us is soil and water and food and air. Those were the days when a forest was this much square foot of timber. I watched this in agriculture, how systems of farming that are unleashing a war against the earth are also unleashing a war against societies with very, very many faces. The first phase is the fact that non-sustainable farming is the biggest cause for the creation of the refugee crisis. 2 years ago was the year of soil, and we did a manifesto. I chair a commission on the future of food and agriculture. And we decided to do a manifesto on soil, but it was the same year when all these boats were sinking in the Mediterranean. And we had the Secretary General of the UN Treaty on Land Degradation and Desertification, a treaty most people don't even know exists. And most people don't know anymore that there's a United Nations. Your government doesn't want to be part of it anyway. I mean, most speeches of your representative is about how it shouldn't exist. So we worked together. We said, let's connect the issue of soil and the issue of refugees. So where were the biggest refugee floods into Europe coming from? Syria and Africa. So we took two cases. Syria, 2009, there had been a severe drought. Combination of climate aggravation of drought. Droughts have been around. Intensive droughts are what climate change creates. They'd had the green revolution, like India had the green revolution, mining water. That agriculture, like war, uses 10 times more water to produce the same amount of food. I've done these calculations again and again in India, 10 times more water. On our farm, by doing ecological farming, the water level has come up 70 feet. You do chemical farming, industrial farming, your water levels are everywhere going down. And you know, the two sides about industrial farming that hurt my eyes are one, these war machines on your fields. And second is these giant irrigation systems. From the air you look, there's these, in the middle of a desert, you suddenly see a circle of green. And you know water's being mined. And you wonder how long it'll last. So 2009, there'd already been a crisis of 1 million refugees in Syria. that was used as an opportunity for selling arms and creating conflicts. There was no conflict between different sects of Islam in Syria. But today we have a mess that no one knows how to solve anymore. Or take Africa. One of the biggest water bodies of Africa is Lake Chad, surrounded by 4 countries. 22,000 square kilometer lake. Today it has shrunk to nothing. You just go to the web and see the lake disappear. 80% of the water that used to go into the lake was diverted through dams and irrigation systems for commercial crops for export. The lake started to die. But there were pastoralists, there were fisher folk, there were farmers supported by this. Conflicts start. Normally, you would say they're conflicts because of the destruction of natural resources. How were they presented? As religious issues. I won't go into the details of the rest, but I do a training of the highest security training college of India called the National Defense College, where brigadiers and generals come to study from around the world. And last year when I was addressing them, there was a brigadier from Nigeria. And he said, what you're saying, Dr. Shiva, is so true. We should not see this as a military problem of terrorism and extremism. We should see it as an ecological problem of the need to heal the earth. If we can bring life back to that region by allowing the water to flow back into Lake Chad, planting more trees. There is one part on the west where tree planting has managed to stabilize ecosystems so much that they don't have conflicts. Because if you have enough land, you have enough water. 45% increase in armed conflict is predicted by this new UN report, which is talking about the erosion of 24 billion tons of soil every year. Already 3.2 billion people impacted by this. And they're predicting more than 700 million refugees in the next few years because of the capacity of the land to support you dying. Now, just extrapolate in your minds what this massive migration means. Add it to climate disasters. For a while, you're going to get a few parties that will say, keep everyone out. But that will not be able to manage it. So, the way to go to the next step is to know that we can live with care on this earth. Our work in Navdanya has shown that we can increase food production and nutrition production enough to feed 2 times the world population. We don't measure yield of commodities, which are anyway nutritionally empty and loaded with toxics. We measure nutrition of diversity. The more you intensify diversity, the more food you have. The more you intensify diversity, the more rural communities have incomes. 10 times more incomes answer to poverty. Most importantly, the biggest answer to climate change is to take all of these excess emissions that have been pushed into the atmosphere by a fossil fuel system and a fossil fuel-based chemical system and work with nature to bring them back into the soil. So our work in Navdanya has shown that we can build up about 2 tons of organic matter per hectare. If the world did that kind of farming, we could reverse the emissions that are leading to climate instability in 10 years. The gap is 20 gigatons. We could reabsorb it and make the soil fertile and give more hands. You remember that you had a dust bowl? We're having a planetary dust bowl. And at that point, what did Teddy Roosevelt do? Created the Conservation Corps. We need a World Conservation Corps. And it's only faiths that will be able to mobilize this initiative. Because sadly, the scientific mind has become so reductionist so sadly reductionist, and given that there is such a poverty across society, that more and more those who fund it, any research, I mean, you'll see more work on how to grow food on Mars, more money there than how to grow the 1-acre farm that Yale has. Yeah? You'll have more money on how to have a hotel in space, I'm told that's already been built and they're already booking it, than how to have a home and a community. So given that the money was made in strange ways by strange heads, that's what they'll finance more. Yeah? And we do need other approaches. We need other ways of thinking. But I was talking about, the chemical farms in our valley have lost organic matter 14%. Ours have gained organic matter up to 99%. We apply urea, we think we're adding nitrogen. Nitrogen has gone down 22% in chemical farms, gone up 100% in organic farms. But when you give back to the earth with deep gratitude, you are not just taking care of the nitrogen and the organic matter, you're letting the earth give you all the other nutrients, the micronutrients and trace elements, which are the disease epidemic of today, whether it be depression or this thing they call a psychological problem called attention deficit disorder. I think more kids are being drugged for that. All it takes is a little magnesium in your soil, in your plants, in your diet. So the more diverse your agriculture, the more diverse your diet is. And now, suddenly now, at this point, after all of these years of bombarding our bodies as if our bodies too had to have a war against them, suddenly they're waking up to the fact that we have something called the gut microbiome, which has trillions of microorganisms. And they're super intelligent. We can be fooled by junk food on the shelves. We can be fooled by saying Roundup is safe. They're deeply aware. But they are what make us tick, including our brain functions. That's why it's called the second nervous system, our second brain. It's these new connections that are creating new possibilities, and they're creating an amazing possibility to be co-creators and partners with nature in seeding the possibility of a future at a time where everyone, the top scientists, are saying no future on this earth. Escape. Escape is irresponsible. You don't mess up your home and try and run away. It is a very patriarchal syndrome, Create a mess, leave it. Always be someone else to clean that mess. Yeah? Can't create a mess and can't abandon it either. Because we have ways to not create waste and to not leave a wasted planet and create wasted people. One of the things that is really troubling me and which I'm trying to address is the fact that more and more of these new billionaires, they stole elections, they stole money. They're now talking about anyway 99% of the people will be useless people. Because artificial intelligence will take over. First of all, intelligence can't be artificial. It is or it's not. A machine learning programming, machine learning is not intelligence, because intelligence is intellegere, how to make choices. These are choices living systems make in a constant process of responding to what's happening. But this assumption that 99% of humanity can be wasted. And I need to keep making my billions. If it doesn't work, first you drive out farmers and make them all drivers. That's what's happening in India. And then you say, no, we'll have driverless cars with artificial intelligence. I think we have to get out of this linearity trap. We've got to realize that life cycles. Life is a cycle. And that amazing cycle is not a sign of no action, no economy, no production. It is the true sign of how healthy, how well, how abundant systems are. And of course, the idea that nature is dead, that we are separate from nature, that women don't work, that peasants don't produce, these fundamental ideas that are guiding the way we think about economics and the way we think about science, sadly we have to revisit them because they're getting us very stuck. So I keep sowing seeds and I look into the future, not saying we will be able to solve the problem, but at least we tried. Thank you.
Thank you very much, not only for your speech, but maybe even more importantly for your life. And what you embody is evident in what you say, and we thank you. It's time to allow you to ask a few questions. I'm going to bring you the mic. If you have a question, if you'd raise your hand, I'd ask you to identify yourself if you would please, so that our speaker will know who you are. And pose your question succinctly, as I sometimes like to say. Disguise your comment as a question, please. So the floor is open. Who would like to ask Dr. Shiva a question? Over here.
Thank you so much for coming here today. My name is Liz. I'm about to graduate from a concentration here at the Divinity School in Religion and Ecology. I wanted to ask you if you have any suggestions or perspective on how to speak about nonviolence from a relational perspective that has come up in your work.
Well, the best I can do is quote Gandhi. For him, nonviolence was not just the absence of violence, but an active engagement in compassion. Ahimsa, or nonviolence, is the basis of many faiths that have emerged in India and across the world. Not doing no harm. And in our times, I believe, as for Gandhi, compassion is not charity, but compassion is knowing we are related, we are interconnected, and then to know that at times it calls for courage, that compassion without courage in times of threat is empty.
Yes, John.
Vandana, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. And I wanted to draw you out with regard to our realization now that the number of genes is much more limited than we might have thought 2 decades ago, and that we have begun to reassess it's not genes that control organic life, but rather cellular activity and the interrelationship with cells in the larger ecology or an environment. Has this thinking entered into your work? And could you...
Very much. You know, my work on the Green Revolution began with the recognition that it's the soil and the biodiversity that's growing whatever is growing, not the chemicals that were applied. This much I understand. Chemicals don't grow things. So to argue that you'll grow more by by applying more chemicals was just scientifically wrong. In terms of the idea of genetic determinism, or it was also called the central dogma, that the gene is a master molecule and it dictates everything to everyone else. It was known to be wrong even in the beginning, even while the ideology was being constructed. The real biologists knew this was not the way things work, that the gene doesn't have any capacity, it's a dead molecule. It's in the context of a living system that is self-organized, that it gets its ability, but that ability can be changed according to the larger regulatory process of a living system. That is why you now have a new discipline called epigenetics, where the gene's behavior is changed. And more scientists are now realizing that actually it's that ecological evolutionary memory that is creating the multiple responses. But again, like I said, there's so much invested in genetic reductionism because if something is self-organized, I can't manipulate it. I can work with it. But if I claim I'm engineering something, that's where I can own it. So the genetic reductionism and determinism idea is central to the idea of owning life and collecting royalties. But it is scientifically absolutely flawed.
Thank you, Vandana. You've been a hero of mine for a long time, and I echo what you say. Thank you for your life. And I am not part of the Yale community per se. I live in an outlying community in Wallingford, Connecticut, and my husband and I do environmental programming and have for the last 6 years in our community. And we show films and we have a community discussion. And I was wondering what you think for people outside of a university or outside of an academic setting or even outside of a, what do I say? How do I say it? Like these global symposiums and these types of things. So for the layperson, what would you say is the best way to engage in change, to engage the current systems that are regulating this war agriculture that we all feel and know inherently, but yet it's difficult to speak to. It's even our families sometimes about it. So how would you say is best to engage? And would you also say, I guess the question is, people ask me a lot of times what they can do, and my answer seems to be whatever is on your heart, whatever is burning on your heart to do it, step into it now. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you agree with that.
Well, I think the two ways in which these concerns can and should be made everyone's concern. The first is we are not separate from the environment. We spread the poisons outside, they are in our bodies. And I find it very interesting that I had to address the National Cancer Association last year, and the hall full of women victims of cancer had been made to believe cancer is genetically determined. 5% cancers are genetically determined. And even there, whether you have a breast cancer gene doesn't predict that you will get breast cancer, because that depends on other things, how you eat, how you live, whether you have stress. So it's that interaction. When I started, my concern was the earth, the biodiversity, and small farmers. I think today we have to realize that destructive food has made 75% people victims to chronic diseases that weren't an epidemic. You might have had cancer, but it wasn't an epidemic. You might have had tension, hypertension, but it wasn't an epidemic. Definitely obesity and diabetes wasn't an epidemic. And anything that changes, simple scientific fact, can't be genetic, because genetics has to stay within the same population percentage. I think everyone is suffering because of issues of health, because of bad food. And I know in this country, I talked about the gut microbiome. Intestinal disorders are an epidemic. Kids are having leaky gut syndrome. How could we do that to ourselves? And forget the cancers and the heart diseases, but just neurological problems now. Autism, the CDC data shows that it'll be 1 in 2 kids if it continues to increase at the rate at which it is. And then you look at the gut microbiome and what's going on and what happens to the gut is determining how our brains function, because they produce those enzymes produce the neurotransmitters. So I think food is a very important connector. Health is given that everyone's got a health problem, or someone they know has a health problem, where do these diseases come from? We've done a book on food as health, and I've done it with doctors and public health people of India, including all of Navdanya's learnings from biodiversity. It is published in this country by Acres Publishing. I know we call it food as health, they might call it something else, but if you go to Acres Publishing, you'll find that title. We offer a course, one-month course every year on how to take care of the earth and yourself. It's called the A to Z of agroecology and organic food systems. And this year in October, I'm doing a very big biodiversity congress to bring every discipline to address the issue of life on earth and the non-separation between the well-being of the planet and our well-being. And we're giving the theme, building an ecological civilization, towards an ecological civilization. Because if we can manage that, extinction is not inevitable. And we have a duty to manage it, because who gave us the responsibility to destroy this beautiful earth?
We're going to take 2 more questions, and I'll let you each pose your question, and then you may respond, and then I'm going to let us all adjourn for some refreshments and more conversation informally.
Thank you. My name's Anna Thurston. I'm a joint degree student at the School of Forestry and at the Institute of Sacred Music. And my question for you is, at the beginning of your presentation today, you had mentioned that women would have a specific role in carrying this work forward. And I would like to hear what specific things you envision women and mothers doing in this work to carry forth nonviolence.
Thank you. So,
one more question.
Oh, sorry.
You may take a vote.
Thank you so much for such a powerful talk. I'm Jennifer Hurd. I'm the faculty here. And you spoke of being opposed to any modification of seed, if I heard you correctly. But of course, the process of agriculture itself over thousands of years has genetically modified seeds. It's just not modified them using recombinant DNA technologies. And I'm wondering if you are opposed to the technologies, or you're opposed to what has been done with the technologies. For example, if we were to use either traditional plant breeding techniques or recombinant DNA techniques in order to cultivate drought-resistant varieties, would that be something that you would be opposed to because it still involves modifying seeds?
Well, let me begin with the second one. I didn't say modification, because life is permanent modification, but self-guided modification. That's what's called autopoiesis. Poiesis is the making, the creation. Autopoiesis is the self-organized, interacting but self-organized, and allopoiesis is when it's imposed. I oppose what denies the living self-organization of living systems and pretends that this is just a genetic mine and it's all you're doing is genetic engineering. That's why I'm extremely happy about the case decision today, because in my country, we rejected a Monsanto application for climate resilient corn. Crops, actually, all crops. And our patent court said, sorry, the plant is reproducing itself, that's not your invention. The genes you're using are known genes, and that's not your invention, it's the known use of a known substance. I won't go into the details of Indian law. So the idea of engineering is different from the idea of self-organized evolution. Yes, seeds have been modified all the time, including by farmers who are brilliant breeders, including by traditional breeders who have given us the amazing seeds. Drought, flood tolerance, salt tolerance, the kinds of seeds we've saved in Navdanya, they are not single gene traits. They are multigenetic traits. And how those genes operate is precisely the issue that John raised, about genes not being building blocks, but being elements of a very, very complicated system. Now, the only two applications that are single gene traits that have been commercialized so far, which are herbicide-resistant crops and Bt toxin crops. One was supposed to control weeds, the other was supposed to control pests. One has given you super weeds, destroying your farmland, and now giving you more lethal weedicides like dicamba. And in India, we've had a total failure of the Bt cotton to control the bollworm. This year, 130 farmers died of pesticide poisoning for spraying on a crop that was never supposed to use spraying. That's what the advertisements used to say. So I am a realist enough to assess tools for what they're supposed to do. I don't elevate technology to ideology. I definitely don't elevate it to religion that a new church wants us to obey. That's why I repeat often, the idea that GMOs means God move over is a flawed idea at every level, from science and ethics to our place in creation. And that place in creation is really the issue of creativity. I think what we have to reclaim is the fact that we are children of Mother Earth, and she has many children. We are just one species among so many. That's why I talk of Earth democracy. That's why I talk of us being part of the Earth family. I think all cultures that lasted, their symbolism of the divine was a woman, was a mother. All. And if you look at ecology, for 6,000 years, there weren't wars, as long as cultures organized themselves in the creative, non-violent female form. And that didn't mean that the men were not seeing that. It was in them too. What is the role today of women? First of all, to absolutely refuse to believe that we don't have mothers, including the earth, and to somehow feel that you're doing wrong if you become a mother. That's why I celebrate Jackie and for her new baby. My most fulfilling moment was the moment I delivered my boy. Because we've been many, if you look at the literature, it says, women merely participate in nature and reproduce. We go out to conquer. It's that has created the problems. That's where I was saying, the idea that violence is action and renewing life and reproducing life is passivity, that's what we have to change. That this is the highest creation, and violence is war. We've got to stop confusing war and conquest as the creative act and recognize it to be the destructive act it is. That is why I don't go with my colleagues, the scientists, who are calling this age of ours the Anthropocene. Anthropocentrism has got us into this problem. To call this age the Anthropocene is to say we are now in control. No, all it means is we take responsibility for the damage humans can do. The power to destroy is not the power to create. The power to create is in nature, it's in each of us, it's in the mothers, and that power to create is what has to burst out now. And every destructive power in violent form that thinks because of its ability to have destructive power, it should have the ability to determine your life, the life of the planet, the life of the future generations, that is the paradigm shift. That is the worldview shift we need to make. And that's why schools like this have a bigger role in terms of how do we shift our thinking to be far more at peace with the earth and with ourselves and the future.